The last bell. The rusted chain-link fence sagged under the weight of years and neglect, its metal fingers clutching desperately at overgrown weeds that had claimed the perimeter of Millbrook Elementary. Sarah Chen pressed her camera against the gap, focusing on the crumbling brick facade that had once welcomed hundreds of children each morning. Now, broken windows stared back like hollow eyes, their glass teeth jagged and threatening. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus whispered, his breath forming small clouds in the October air. The urban explorer adjusted his backpack, heavy with equipment they'd need for the overnight investigation. The locals weren't exactly thrilled when we asked about this place. Sarah lowered her camera, her dark eyes reflecting the dying light. "That's exactly why we need to document it. 3 schools don't just get abandoned simultaneously without reason. The city claims budget cuts, but the records show something else entirely." Behind them, their third companion, Jake, finished cutting through the fence with bolt cutters. The metallic snap echoed across the empty playground where swings moved gently in the breeze, their chains creaking a mournful song. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have entry," he announced, his usual bravado slightly forced. The trio slipped through the gap, their footsteps crunching on broken glass and debris. Sarah immediately began photographing, her flash illuminating strange details: a single child's shoe sitting perfectly upright beside the main entrance, a lunch tray balanced impossibly on the edge of a broken window, children's artwork still pinned to bulletin boards despite years of exposure to the elements. The front doors hung open, one dangling from a single hinge. As they crossed the threshold, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Their flashlight beams danced across walls covered in peeling paint and strange stains that seemed to move in the shifting light. "Check this out," Marcus called from what had once been the main office. His light illuminated a desk calendar, its pages turned to October 31st, 1987. 36 years ago exactly. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "That's the date the school was evacuated. The official report mentions a gas leak, but..." She trailed off, studying a photograph on the wall. It showed a classroom full of children, their faces bright with innocent smiles. But there was something wrong with their eyes, they all seemed to be looking at something just outside the frame. Jake's voice echoed from deeper in the building. "Guys, you need to see this." They found him standing in the hallway outside what had been the cafeteria. The walls were covered in children's handprints, hundreds of them, but instead of paint, they appeared to be made in some dark, rust-colored substance that had long since dried. The prints led down the corridor, getting smaller and smaller, as if the children who made them were shrinking as they walked. "This wasn't in any of the reports," Sarah murmured, documenting everything. Her camera's flash seemed weaker here, the darkness pressing in around them like a living thing. As they followed the trail of handprints, they began to hear it, a soft humming, barely audible, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a children's song, one that none of them recognized but that felt hauntingly familiar. The handprints led to a classroom door marked, "Mrs. Patterson, 3rd grade." Unlike the other doors they'd passed, this one was closed and bore no signs of damage. Sarah reached for the handle, then hesitated. The humming was louder here, and underneath it, she could swear she heard the soft scratch of chalk on a blackboard. "Maybe we should," Marcus began, but Sarah had already turned the handle. The door swung open silently, revealing a classroom frozen in time. 24 desks sat in perfect rows, each with a child's belongings still arranged on top: pencil cases, workbooks, small toys. The blackboard at the front bore a message in faded white chalk: "Class dismissed. Please form a line." But it was the children's drawings covering every available wall space that made Jake step backward into the hallway. They were all the same image, rendered in crayon by dozens of different hands: a tall, thin figure in a dark coat standing at the front of a classroom. The figure had no face, just a smooth blank where features should be. And in every drawing, stick figure children stood in a line, their hands reaching toward this faceless teacher. Sarah's camera wouldn't work in the room. Every time she pressed the shutter, the flash failed, and the LCD screen showed nothing but static. Her hands were shaking now, though she tried to hide it. "The electromagnetic readings are off the charts in here," she said, checking her equipment. The humming stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, they could hear their own breathing, their heartbeats, and something else, the soft sound of footsteps in the hallway behind them. Small footsteps, like those of children. They turned as one, their flashlights illuminating the empty corridor. But there, in the dust on the floor, fresh footprints appeared one by one, as if invisible children were walking past them. The prints were small, the size a third grader might make, and they led deeper into the school. "We should leave," Marcus said, his voice barely steady. "Right now." But Jake was already following the footprints, his light bobbing ahead of them. "Wait," he called back. "There's something you need to see." Reluctantly, Sarah and Marcus followed. The footprints led to the school's gymnasium, where they stopped abruptly at the center of the basketball court. Jake stood there, his light pointed upward, his face pale with shock. 24 small nooses hung from the rafters, swaying gently despite the absence of any breeze. "Jesus Christ," Marcus breathed, stumbling backward. Sarah's hands moved automatically, trying to photograph the scene, but her camera remained dead. This can't be." She pulled out her phone, but its screen flickered and went dark. All their electronic equipment was failing. That's when they heard the voices. At first, it sounded like wind, but gradually they could make out words, children's voices, singing. The same tune they'd heard humming in the hallway, but now they could understand the lyrics. "Ring around the classroom, pocket full of secrets. Ashes, ashes, we all fall, down." The temperature plummeted. Their breath came out in sharp puffs as ice began to form on the gymnasium walls. And then, in the growing cold, they saw them. Children. Translucent figures in 1980s clothing, their faces bearing expressions of confusion and fear. They stood in a line at the center of the court, just as they had been drawn in the classroom pictures. 24 children, holding hands, staring at something behind Sarah and her friends. Sarah turned slowly, knowing with horrible certainty what she would see. The figure from the drawing stood in the gymnasium doorway. Tall, impossibly thin, wearing a dark coat that seemed to absorb light. Where its face should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin. It raised one long arm, pointing at the three intruders, and when it spoke, its voice was like chalk scraping on stone. "Class is still in session." The ghost children turned toward them, their hollow eyes pleading. Sarah understood then what had happened here, what the cover-up had hidden. These children hadn't died in a gas leak. They had been taken, one, by something that had worn the face of a teacher, something that had convinced them to line up, to follow, to trust. "Run," she whispered. They broke for the exit, but the doors slammed shut before they could reach them. The lights that hadn't worked in decades, began to flicker on, one by one, revealing the full horror of the gymnasium. The walls were covered in children's names, carved deep into the brick. Names and dates spanning decades, going back far longer than the school's official records showed. The faceless figure glided toward them, its movements fluid and wrong. Behind it, the ghost children followed, still holding hands, their mouths opening in a silent scream. Sarah grabbed a basketball from the floor and hurled it at the nearest window. The glass exploded outward, letting in the night air and the distant sound of traffic, proof that the world beyond still existed. "The window," she shouted. Jake boosted Marcus up first, then Sarah. As she pulled herself through the broken frame, she felt cold fingers brush her ankle. She looked back to see the faceless thing reaching for her, its smooth features somehow conveying infinite hunger and patience. She kicked free and tumbled to the ground outside. Behind her, Jake was climbing through when the building seemed to exhale, a great, sighing breath that extinguished every light simultaneously. In the sudden darkness, they heard him scream. Sarah and Marcus ran back to the window, but Jake was gone. The gymnasium was empty except for the swaying nooses and a new drawing on the wall, a crude crayon sketch showing 3 figures entering a classroom, but only 2 leaving. They fled then, stumbling through the overgrown playground, through the hole in the fence, not stopping until they reached their car. Sarah's hands shook as she tried to start the engine, and in the rearview mirror, she saw a figure standing at one of the school's upper windows, too tall to be a child, too still to be human. The local police found no trace of Jake. The official report cited equipment failure and accidental injury, suggesting he had fallen through rotted floorboards into the basement. They sealed the building, posted new warnings, and the case was closed. But Sarah knows the truth. On quiet nights, when the wind is right, she can still hear children singing that horrible song. And sometimes, in the photographs she managed to take before her equipment failed, she can make out shapes in the shadows, small figures holding hands, waiting patiently for their next classmate to arrive. The Millbrook Elementary building was demolished 6 months later, but the lot remains empty. Local children refuse to walk past it, claiming they can hear a school bell ringing in the distance, calling them to a class that never ends. And on October 31st each year, neighbors report seeing lights in the windows of a building that no longer exists, and the faint sound of children reciting lessons in the dark. Sarah never returned to urban exploring. But she kept one photograph, the only one that developed properly. It shows the empty gymnasium, and if you look carefully at the shadows in the corner, you can just make out a figure in modern clothes, standing in line with 24 children from another era. The attendance is always perfect in Mrs. Patterson's class. Lesson plan. The October rain drummed against the windshield as Emma pulled into the overgrown parking lot of Ridgemont High School. The building loomed before her like a monument to decay, its red brick facade stained dark with moisture and neglect. Broken windows stared down at her rental car, their jagged edges catching what little light filtered through the storm clouds above. She sat for a moment, gathering courage she didn't feel. The letter in her passenger seat bore the school district's official letterhead, though the words still seemed impossible. We regret to inform you that due to budget constraints, all remaining records from Ridgemont High will be disposed of by November 1st. As Thomas Chen's only living relative, you have until then to claim any personal effects. Thomas. Her older brother, dead now for 15 years. The brother who had vanished from this very school during his senior year, leaving behind nothing but questions and a family torn apart by grief and suspicion. The police had investigated, of course, but teenage runaways were common enough, and there had been no evidence of foul play. Just a brilliant 17-year-old who had apparently decided to disappear without a trace. Emma grabbed her flashlight and stepped into the rain. The main entrance was chained shut, but she'd done her research. The maintenance door on the east side had been left unlocked by previous urban explorers, a detail she'd found on an obscure forum dedicated to abandoned places. The door opened with a groan of rusted hinges, releasing the smell of mold and something else, something sweet and cloying that made her stomach turn. She stepped inside, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to reveal a corridor lined with lockers, their metal doors hanging open like broken teeth. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, creating small puddles that reflected her light. As she walked deeper into the school, her footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound was being stretched and distorted by the empty spaces around her. The main hallway stretched before her, longer than she remembered from the photographs in the police file. Classroom doors stood ajar, revealing glimpses of desks covered in dust and debris. Inspirational posters hung in tatters from the walls, "Reach for the stars," and "Knowledge is power." Their cheerful messages rendered grotesque by time and neglect. Emma consulted the school map she'd printed from the district archives. Thomas's locker should be on the second floor, number 247. She climbed the central staircase, noting how the banister felt sticky under her palm despite the years of abandonment. The second floor was darker, if that was possible. Her flashlight seemed weaker here, its beam swallowed by shadows that pressed in from all sides. She found the corridor she needed and began counting locker numbers: 241, 243, 245. Locker 247 stood slightly apart from the others, its door partially open. Emma approached it slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Inside, she found exactly what she'd been told to expect: Thomas's belongings, perfectly preserved after all these years. His backpack hung from a hook, his textbook stacked neatly on the shelf, even his jacket folded carefully on the bottom. But it was the notebook that caught her attention. It lay open on top of his chemistry textbook, its pages covered in Thomas's familiar handwriting. She lifted it carefully, angling her flashlight to read. Day 847, still here. Still trapped. The others don't remember anymore, but I do. I remember everything: the day I tried to leave, the way the doors wouldn't open, the way time stopped meaning anything. Mrs. Holloway keeps teaching, even though her throat was cut in 1987. Mr. Peterson still coaches basketball, though his hands shake from the pills he took in his car that winter night in 1995. We're all still here. All of us who never left. The students, the teachers, the janitor who had his heart attack in the boiler room. We attend classes that never end, take tests that grade themselves, participate in activities that have no purpose beyond filling the endless hours. But I remember. I remember that there's a world outside, a world where time moves forward and people grow old and die properly. I write this hoping someone will find it, hoping someone will understand. This school is hungry. It feeds on the unwilling, on those who have nowhere else to go, on the lost and the forgotten. It won't let us leave. It won't let us rest. Emma's hands trembled as she turned the page. The entries continued, growing more erratic and desperate as they progressed. Day 1203. Tried the windows again today. They're not really windows anymore, just pictures of the outside world, frozen in time. The rain never stops falling, but it never reaches the ground. The cars in the parking lot never move, but their engines always sound like they're about to start. Sarah Martinez sits behind me in calculus. She's been dead for 8 years, overdose in the bathroom after prom. But every day at 2:15, she raises her hand to ask about derivatives, and Mr. Brennan explains the same concept with the same words, in the same tone, forever. I've tried to tell them. I've tried to make them remember. But they look at me with empty eyes and ask when I'm going to stop being so weird and just accept my place here. My place. In this classroom that smells like formaldehyde. In this school that breathes with the lungs of the dead. Emma flipped through more pages, her horror growing with each entry. Thomas had documented everything. The teachers who had died years before the school closed but still showed up to work every day, the students who had committed suicide or died in accidents but continued attending classes, the way time seemed to loop and stutter in certain corridors. The final entry was dated just 3 months ago. Day 5475, I found the source today. In the basement, behind the boiler room, there's a door that wasn't on any of the original blueprints. Inside, there's a room full of filing cabinets. Every drawer contains a contract, binding agreements between the school board and something that calls itself the Academic Eternal Education Foundation. The contracts are written in blood on parchment that feels like human skin. They promise unlimited funding, guaranteed test scores, perfect attendance rates. All in exchange for ensuring that learning never stops, that education continues beyond the constraints of life and death. The school board members signed willingly. They wanted Ridgemont to be the best, to be remembered forever. They got their wish. But I think I found a way out. The contracts specify that only those enrolled in good standing are bound to the institution. If someone could be expelled, if someone could be officially removed from the student body. I'm going to try something tomorrow. If this doesn't work, if I don't escape, maybe someone will find this notebook. Maybe someone will understand that we're not really here by choice. Tell Emma I'm sorry. Tell her I love her. Tell her that sometimes the dead can still learn new things, like regret, and loneliness, and the weight of time when it has no meaning. The bell is about to ring. Time for chemistry class. Emma closed the notebook, her mind reeling. This couldn't be real. Thomas had run away, had started a new life somewhere else. This notebook was just what? A cruel hoax. A manifestation of her own guilt and desperate need for answers. But as she stood there in the darkness, she became aware of a sound that made her blood freeze, the distant ring of a school bell. Impossible. The school had been closed for a decade. There was no electricity, no functioning systems. But the bell continued to ring, its tone clear and commanding, echoing through the empty corridors. And then she heard them, footsteps. Hundreds of footsteps, moving through the building with purpose and precision. Locker doors slamming, voices chattering, the familiar sounds of students changing classes. Emma ran toward the staircase, but stopped short when she saw them, translucent figures moving through the halls, their faces blank and purposeful. Students in clothing from different decades, some in the casual wear of the 2000s, others in the more formal attire of earlier eras. They walked through the corridors as if she wasn't there, heading to classes that shouldn't exist in a building that should be empty. She pressed herself against the wall as they passed, noting the way their footsteps made no sound despite the thunderous echo she'd heard moments before. A girl in a 1990s grunge outfit walked through her, the sensation like being touched by cold mist. But one figure wasn't translucent. One figure cast a shadow in her flashlight beam and turned to look at her with eyes that held recognition and desperate hope. Emma. It was Thomas. Older than he should be, wearing the same clothes he'd had on the day he disappeared, but unmistakably her brother. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow with exhaustion and something that might have been madness. Thomas, oh God, Thomas. She reached for him, but he stepped back. You shouldn't be here, he said, his voice carrying a strange echo, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. It's not safe. The school doesn't like visitors. It prefers students. I came to find you. I found your notebook. Thomas, we have to get out of here. He laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Get out. Emma, I've been trying to get out for 15 years. Time doesn't work right here. Sometimes I experience the same day 100 times. Sometimes I skip forward months without realizing it. The only constant is the classes, the endless, meaningless classes. Around them, the ghostly students continued their march to whatever lessons awaited them. Emma noticed that some moved more naturally than others, the recent additions still retained some spark of individuality, while others seemed completely absorbed into the school's rhythm. The notebook, she said urgently. You wrote about finding a way out. The contracts, the expulsion. I tried, Thomas interrupted. I tried to get myself expelled. I disrupted classes, failed tests, broke every rule I could think of. But the administration here doesn't work like the real world. Principal Morrison has been dead since 1982, but he still runs the school with the same iron fist. He won't expel anyone. Perfect attendance is too important to the statistics. The bell rang again, and Thomas winced. I have to go. Physics class with Mr. Dalton. If I'm late, they'll give me detention, and detention here lasts forever. Literally forever. Wait. Emma grabbed his arm, shocked to find it solid and warm. What if someone else expelled you? What if someone from outside the system? Emma, no. His eyes widened with understanding and terror. You're not a student here. You're not bound by the contracts. If you try to interfere with the school's operations, if you try to act with administrative authority you don't have. But Emma was already moving, following the flow of students down the corridor. She had seen the administrative offices on the first floor during her initial exploration. If this place operated on supernatural logic, then maybe, just maybe, the rules could be bent by someone who didn't belong to the system. "Emma, stop." Thomas called after her, but he was caught in the stream of students heading to class. She watched as his individual will seemed to weaken, subsumed by the school's inexorable pull. She fought against the current of ghostly students, their cold forms passing through her as she pushed toward the main office. The frosted glass door stood slightly ajar, revealing a reception area frozen in time. The secretary's desk was covered with papers from 1999, the year the school officially closed. Behind it, the principal's office waited in darkness. Emma stepped inside, her flashlight revealing wood-paneled walls covered with photographs of graduating classes stretching back decades. But in each photo, she noticed, there were spaces where students should be, gaps in the carefully arranged rows, as if certain individuals had been edited out of history. The principal's desk was massive, its surface dominated by a leather-bound ledger that lay open to a page titled Current Enrollment. Hundreds of names were listed in perfect calligraphy, some in ink that looked decades old, others seemingly written yesterday. She found Thomas's name near the bottom of the current page, Thomas Chen, class of 2007, status, active, detention credits, 5,847. Beside the ledger lay an antique fountain pen and a rubber stamp reading, expelled, academic misconduct. Emma's hands shook as she picked up the pen. The ink flowed red instead of black, and she realized with horror that it wasn't ink at all. But she had to try. Thomas had been trapped here for 15 years, slowly losing himself to the school's endless routine. If there was even a chance this might work. She crossed out active next to Thomas's name and wrote expelled in the red substance. Then she pressed the stamp firmly beside his entry, leaving a clear mark in the ledger. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The building began to shake, windows rattling in their frames, dust raining from the ceiling. From somewhere deep within the school came a sound like screaming, high-pitched and full of rage. The lights flickered on throughout the building, revealing the full scope of the supernatural classroom activities happening in every room. Emma ran from the office, following the sound of Thomas's voice calling her name. She found him in the physics classroom, standing at his desk while around him ghostly students continued taking notes as if nothing had happened. But Thomas looked different, more solid somehow, more present. "It worked," he said, wonder in his voice. "I can feel it. The pull is gone. The need to stay is." He never finished the sentence. The classroom door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The overhead lights blazed brighter, and the ghostly students turned as one to stare at Emma with expressions of hunger and resentment. Mr. Dalton materialized at the front of the classroom, a thin man with kind eyes that had been sewn shut with black thread. When he spoke, his voice came from somewhere else, echoing through the room like a recording played backward. "Miss Chen," he said, and Emma realized with horror that he was addressing her, not Thomas. "Welcome to Ridgemont High. I see you've enrolled yourself by taking administrative action within our institution. How wonderful. We so rarely get new students these days." Emma backed toward the windows, but they showed only that same frozen view of rain that never reached the ground. "I'm not a student here. I was just trying to help my brother." "Oh, but you are," Mr. Dalton replied. "The moment you signed that ledger, the moment you used school property to perform an administrative function, you became part of our academic family. And now that your brother has graduated, expelled, technically, but the result is the same, we have an opening in his class." Thomas was fading, becoming translucent again, but in the opposite direction. He was becoming more real, more present in the physical world, as Emma felt herself becoming lighter, less substantial. "The conservation of education," Mr. Dalton continued conversationally, as if explaining a physics principle. "Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred from one student to another. Your brother is free to go, Miss Chen. But someone must take his place. Someone must continue his education." Emma felt the weight of 15 years settling on her shoulders, the accumulated time Thomas had spent trapped in this place. She was aging rapidly, catching up to the time debt he had accumulated. Her hair grew longer, her clothes changed to match the period when she would have been a student. "Thomas, run," she managed to say before her voice began to echo like all the others. He was almost fully corporeal now, no longer bound to the school's supernatural hold. Tears streamed down his face as he reached for her, but his hand passed through her increasingly ghostly form. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, Emma." "Tell Mom I found you," she said, her voice growing distant. "Tell her we both came home, in a way." Thomas stumbled toward the window, and this time it opened for him, opened onto a world where rain actually fell and time moved forward. He climbed through, tumbling onto the wet ground outside, gasping the sweet air of freedom. Behind him, the school settled back into its routine. In the physics classroom, a new student took notes with supernatural diligence, her handwriting growing more controlled and mechanical with each passing day. Sometimes she would look up at the window, remembering something about a world outside, about a brother she had loved. But the memories faded. The lessons were more important. The education never ended. And in the abandoned parking lot, Thomas Chen stood in the rain and wept for the sister who had saved him and doomed herself. He would go home. He would try to explain to their parents what had happened. He would live the life Emma had given him. But every October, when the rain fell hard and the world grew dark early, he would return to this place and see lights in the windows of the abandoned school. He would hear the sound of lessons being taught and students learning things that no one should ever have to know. And sometimes, just sometimes, he would see her face in one of those windows, a face that grew younger each year as the school consumed her memories and replaced them with endless, meaningless knowledge. The education continues. It always continues. Class is always in session at Ridgemont High. The perfect student. Detective Lisa Moreau parked her patrol car beside the rusted fence surrounding Oakwood Elementary School. The November wind cut through her jacket as she stepped onto the cracked asphalt, her breath visible in the early morning chill. This was the third call in 2 weeks about disturbances at the abandoned school, children's laughter echoing from empty classrooms, lights flickering in windows that hadn't seen electricity in 8 years. The locals blamed teenagers, but Lisa had her doubts. She'd grown up in this town, had attended Oakwood herself until the incident in 1994 forced its closure. Some memories never fade, no matter how hard you try to bury them. She approached the main entrance, noting the fresh footprints in the mud, small ones, child-sized, leading from the street to the building. But that was impossible. The school had been sealed after the last urban explorer had fallen through rotted floorboards 3 years ago. The city council had welded steel plates over every entrance. Yet the front door stood slightly ajar, its steel barrier hanging from broken hinges. Lisa drew her service weapon and radioed for backup, though she knew it would be 20 minutes before another unit could arrive. She couldn't wait, those footprints were recent, and if some kid was playing in this death trap, every minute counted. The door opened with a squeal of rusted metal. Inside, Lisa was struck by how well-preserved everything appeared. The main hallway stretched before her, lined with colorful bulletin boards and student artwork that should have disintegrated years ago. The smell hit her next, that distinctive elementary school scent of floor wax, cafeteria food, and childhood innocence. But underneath it lurked something else. Something rotten. Lisa followed the small footprints across the polished linoleum floor. They led past the principal's office, past the library with its cheerful reading corner, toward the east wing where the kindergarten and first-grade classrooms were located. The footprints were joined by others now, dozens of small impressions, as if an entire class of children had walked this way. Room 12 had always been her favorite classroom. Mrs. Henderson had taught first grade there for 30 years, and every child in town had learned to read under her patient guidance. But Mrs. Henderson had been the first to die on that terrible day in 1994, and room 12 had been sealed ever since. Now the door stood open, revealing a classroom that defied every law of decay and abandonment. 24 desks sat in perfect rows, each with a fresh worksheet and a sharpened pencil. The blackboard bore the day's lesson plan in Mrs. Henderson's familiar handwriting. Today we will learn about friendship and sharing. And sitting at each desk was a child. Lisa's weapon trembled in her grip as she took in the impossible scene. 24 children, ranging in age from 5 to 7, sat perfectly still with their hands folded on their desks. Their clothes spanned different decades, some wore the casual attire of the 2010s, others the more formal dress of earlier eras. But they all shared the same expression, empty, glassy-eyed contentment. At the front of the classroom stood Mrs. Henderson herself, exactly as Lisa remembered her from 30 years ago. Gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, floral dress, sensible shoes. She held a picture book in her weathered hands and smiled with genuine warmth. "Oh, wonderful!" Mrs. Henderson exclaimed, clapping her hands together. "We have a visitor. Children, can you say hello to Miss Lisa?" 24 small voices spoke in perfect unison. "Hello, Miss Lisa. Welcome to our classroom." Lisa backed toward the door, but it swung shut before she could escape. The click of the lock echoed through the room like a gunshot. Now, Mrs. Henderson said gently, "there's no need to be frightened. We're just having story time. Would you like to join us? I have a special book today, one about a little girl who learned the importance of staying where she belonged." Lisa noticed her reflection in the classroom windows. But while she appeared as a grown woman of 35, her reflection showed a 6-year-old girl in a pink dress and pigtails. The same outfit she'd worn on the last day Oakwood Elementary had been a normal school. "I remember you," Mrs. Henderson continued, approaching with that same kind smile Lisa had loved as a child. "You were such a bright student. Always asking questions, always curious about the world beyond these walls. But curiosity can be dangerous, can't it? It can lead children away from where they're safe." The memories came flooding back then, memories Lisa had spent 30 years trying to forget. The day she discovered Mrs. Henderson's secret room behind the supply closet. The day she'd seen what the teacher was really feeding the class guinea pig. The day she tried to tell her parents and found that no adult would believe her. And the day she'd led the police to room 12, where they'd found the remains of 7 children who had moved away over the years, along with Mrs. Henderson's detailed journals documenting her experiments in behavioral modification through nutritional supplementation. Mrs. Henderson had killed herself that night in her jail cell, but not before writing one final entry: "The children will always need their teacher. Learning never ends. Love never dies." "You ruined everything," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice still sweet but carrying an undertone of infinite sadness. "Do you know how hard it is to start over? To find new students who appreciate the value of a good education?" Lisa looked at the children again and realized the horrible truth. They weren't all from 1994. Some of these faces were more recent, children who had gone missing over the years, cases that had never been solved. The Hendricks boy from 2003, little Sarah Murphy from 2008, the Gonzalez twins from just last summer. "They're so much happier now," Mrs. Henderson continued, stroking the hair of a little girl in the front row. The child didn't react, her glassy eyes fixed on the chalkboard. No more worries about growing up, no more fears about the big, scary world. Just lessons and learning and the safety of childhood forever. Lisa noticed that her own reflection was getting younger, more defined. Her adult memories were becoming fuzzy, replaced by simpler thoughts about coloring books and snack time. She fought against the regression, focusing on her training, her job, the weapon in her hand that was growing heavier by the second. "You can't do this," she managed to say, though her voice sounded higher, more childish than before. "Their parents are looking for them. People will notice." "Oh, but they won't," Mrs. Henderson said, returning to her position at the front of the class. "I've become much better at this over the years. Parents forget, eventually. They move on, have other children, convince themselves it was all a bad dream. And the children here are so well behaved. They never cause trouble, never talk back, never try to leave. She opened the picture book, revealing pages that seemed to move and shift before Lisa's eyes. The illustrations showed a classroom much like this one, but the children in the pictures were screaming, their faces twisted in terror and pain. This story is about a naughty little girl who didn't appreciate her education. Mrs. Henderson began reading. She thought she knew better than her teacher. She brought strangers into the classroom and caused all sorts of trouble. But in the end, she learned that some lessons are worth repeating. Lisa felt herself shrinking, her uniform becoming loose and baggy. Her weapon clattered to the floor, too heavy for her small hands to hold. Around her, the 24 children turned to watch with their empty eyes, their mouths curved in identical, meaningless smiles. But Lisa had one advantage Mrs. Henderson didn't know about. In her years as a police officer, she'd learned to compartmentalize trauma, to function despite fear. And somewhere in the back of her regressing mind, she remembered the secret she'd discovered as a 6-year-old, the one detail that had allowed her to escape 30 years ago. The classroom had 2 doors. Everyone knew about the main entrance, but there was another one hidden behind the reading corner. Mrs. Henderson had used it to move the bodies, to bring in supplies, to maintain her perfect classroom without being seen. As her body continued to shrink, Lisa forced her child-sized legs to carry her toward the corner of the room. Mrs. Henderson was so absorbed in her story that she didn't notice until Lisa's small fingers found the hidden latch. "Now, Lisa," the teacher said, her voice taking on a sharper edge, "you know the rules about wandering around during story time." But Lisa was already through the door, tumbling into a narrow storage room that connected to the old bomb shelter beneath the school. She could hear Mrs. Henderson's voice behind her, calling sweetly for her to come back, but she didn't look over her shoulder. The basement was a maze of tunnels and storage rooms, but Lisa remembered the layout from her childhood explorations. She ran through the darkness, her small feet splashing through puddles of stagnant water, heading for the old maintenance exit that led to the playground. Behind her, she could hear footsteps, not just Mrs. Henderson's sensible shoes, but the patter of 24 pairs of small feet following in perfect synchronization. The children were coming after her, their vacant eyes now glowing with an unnatural light, their mouths open in silent screams. Lisa burst through the maintenance door into the gray November morning, gasping the cold air like a drowning person breaking the surface. But she was still trapped in a child's body, still vulnerable to whatever force had transformed the other children into Mrs. Henderson's perfect students. The footsteps were getting closer. Soon they would emerge from the building, and then nowhere would be safe. Mrs. Henderson's influence extended beyond the classroom. Lisa remembered the way other adults had refused to see what was happening, the way the whole town had seemed complicit in the horror. But as she stood there in the playground, Lisa heard the most beautiful sound in the world: sirens. Her backup was arriving, drawn by her failure to check in. 3 patrol cars screamed into the parking lot, followed by a fire truck and an ambulance. The moment the first officer stepped out of his vehicle, Lisa felt the transformation reverse. Her body stretched and grew, her uniform reforming around her adult frame. She was herself again, Detective Lisa Moreau, 35 years old, trained and armed and very much alive. The other officers found her standing by the swing set, staring at the school building which was once again dark and silent. When they searched the premises, they found nothing but empty rooms and rotting furniture. No children, no teacher, no evidence that anyone had been inside for years. But in room 12, they discovered something that made even the veteran officers step back in horror: 24 small desks arranged in perfect rows, each with a child's name carved into the wood. The names matched missing children reports dating back decades, including 7 from 1994 that had been officially closed when Mrs. Henderson died. Lisa never returned to active duty. She retired early on a disability pension, citing PTSD from childhood trauma. The official report blamed her experience on stress-induced hallucinations and recommended counseling. But late at night, when the wind blows through the empty streets of her hometown, Lisa can still hear it, the sound of children's laughter echoing from an abandoned school, and a teacher's voice reading stories that should never be told. The school board voted to demolish Oakwood Elementary the following spring. The wrecking ball knocked down walls that had stood for 70 years, crushing desks and chalkboards and all the memories they contained. But on the night before the demolition, residents reported seeing lights in the windows one last time. Some claimed to hear a woman's voice singing a lullaby, accompanied by a chorus of children's voices that seemed to come from underground. The lot where Oakwood Elementary once stood remains empty. Plans for a new development have been proposed and abandoned multiple times, always for budget reasons or permit issues that no one can quite explain. Local children avoid the area instinctively, though they can't say why. Their parents tell them it's just an empty lot, nothing to be afraid of, but something in their voices suggests they don't quite believe it themselves. And sometimes, on quiet school nights when the moon is dark, people walking past the empty lot report hearing the faint sound of a bell ringing, not the electronic buzzer of modern schools, but the old-fashioned brass bell that once called children to their lessons at Oakwood Elementary. The bell rings 24 times before falling silent. Always 24 times, one for each perfect student who learned that some lessons last forever, and some teachers never let their children go. Class dismissed. But never truly over.